For 22 years, Sarah Martinez thought she knew exactly what her job was. Every morning at 0530, she'd walk through the gates of Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek in Virginia Beach, flash her ID to the same security guard who'd been there almost as long as she had, and make her way to Building 47. Her workspace was a maze of metal shelving units stacked floor to ceiling with diving equipment, underwater breathing apparatus, and gear that most people couldn't even identify, let alone repair. Hurries, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had nimble fingers and an intuitive understanding of how things worked. While other technicians relied heavily on manuals and diagnostic computers, she could often tell what was wrong with a piece of equipment just by the sound it made, or the way a seal felt when she ran her thumb across it. Her colleagues called it magic. Sarah called it 22 years of obsessive attention to detail. She'd started this job right out of high school in Norfolk, fresh-faced and eager to serve her country in whatever way she could. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been a machinist at Newport News Shipbuilding, and he'd taught her that there was honor in working with your hands, in making things that mattered actually work when lives depended on them. Sarah had inherited his steady hands and his unwavering belief that every bolt, every gasket, every seemingly insignificant component deserved to be treated as if someone's life hung in the balance. Because, as she would eventually learn, it always did. The equipment that crossed Sarah's workbench wasn't ordinary military gear. These weren't the standard issue items that regular Navy personnel used. The breathing apparatus was more sophisticated, designed to function at depths that would crush most conventional equipment. The masks had multiple redundant systems and backup features that seemed almost paranoid in their thoroughness. The dry suits were constructed from materials she'd never seen anywhere else. With sealing systems so complex, they required specialized tools just to properly inspect. But Sarah never asked questions about why the gear was different. That wasn't her job. Her job was to ensure that when someone strapped on one of these breathing units and descended into the crushing darkness of the ocean depths, every component would perform flawlessly. Her job was to make sure that when someone needed to breathe underwater for longer than should be humanly possible, the equipment wouldn't fail them. She approached this responsibility with the kind of methodical precision that bordered on obsession. Every piece of equipment that came through her workshop underwent the same rigorous inspection process she'd developed over the years. She would disassemble each unit completely, examining every O-ring under magnification, testing every valve with pressures that exceeded operational specifications, and replacing components that showed even the slightest signs of wear. Her supervisor, Chief Petty Officer James Reynolds, had tried to speed up her process multiple times over the years. "Martinez," he'd say, "you're spending 3 times longer on each unit than the manual recommends. We've got quotas to meet." But Sarah would just look up from her workbench, her safety glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, and respond the same way every time. "Chief, I've never had a unit come back with a failure. Not once, in 22 years." And it was true. While other technicians occasionally had equipment returned for repairs or experienced field failures, Sarah's units never came back. They went out the door of Building 47 and disappeared into whatever operations required such specialized gear, and they performed flawlessly every single time. Sarah took pride in this perfect record, but she also felt the weight of it. She would lie awake some nights, wondering about the people who used her equipment. She imagined them as Navy divers working on ship hulls, or maybe specialists who cleared underwater obstacles from harbors. She pictured them as dedicated professionals who deserved equipment they could trust completely, people whose families depended on them coming home safely from whatever dangerous work they did in the depths of the ocean. What she never imagined was that the equipment she meticulously maintained and repaired was being used by the most elite warriors in the American military. She never suspected that her obsessive attention to detail, her refusal to let even the smallest imperfection slide, was directly contributing to the success of classified operations in hostile waters around the world. The rebreathers she calibrated with scientific precision were being used by Navy SEALs to approach enemy positions undetected, the closed-circuit systems allowing them to swim for miles without creating the telltale bubble trail that would give away their position. The dry suits she inspected with such care were protecting these warriors as they infiltrated targets in waters so cold it would kill an unprotected person in minutes. The depth gauges and pressure monitors she tested beyond manufacturer specifications were providing critical data to operators conducting missions at depths where the margin for error was measured in seconds and fractions of pressure per square inch. But Sara Martinez, the woman whose craftsmanship was helping to make these impossible missions possible, had no idea she was part of something so significant. She thought she was just a technician doing her job well, maintaining equipment for routine Navy operations. The closest she came to understanding the true nature of her work was when she noticed patterns in the equipment that came through her shop. Certain items would arrive with unusual wear patterns, salt deposits that suggested operations in tropical waters, or sometimes damage that looked like it came from something more challenging than standard training exercises. She would run her fingers over scratches in the equipment housings and wonder what had caused them, but she always pushed the curiosity aside and focused on returning the gear to perfect working condition. There were also the rush orders that would come down from command, usually with very little explanation. Sometimes Chief Reynolds would appear at her workbench with a piece of equipment and an expression that made it clear this wasn't a routine repair. "This one's priority, Martinez," he'd say. "It needs to be ready in 6 hours, and it needs to be perfect." Sara would nod and clear her workbench, understanding that someone, somewhere, was waiting for this specific piece of equipment to complete a mission that couldn't wait. She took these rush orders as seriously as she took everything else, but she still didn't understand the bigger picture. She didn't know that when she worked through the night to repair a rebreather with unusual damage, she might be directly enabling a hostage rescue operation or a critical intelligence gathering mission. She didn't realize that her refusal to compromise on quality, her insistence on replacing components that were technically still within acceptable tolerances, was giving Navy SEALs the confidence they needed to push their equipment to its absolute limits in life-or-death situations. The irony was that Sara Martinez, who had never been through any kind of military training herself, who had never fired a weapon in combat, or parachuted from an aircraft, or fast-roped from a helicopter, was playing a crucial role in preparing the most elite warriors in the world for their most dangerous missions. Her steady hands and meticulous attention to detail were as much a part of their success as their physical conditioning and tactical training. Every night, Sara would clean her workbench, organize her tools, and lock up Building 47, thinking she was just a technician who happened to be very good at her job. She would drive home to her small apartment in Virginia Beach, heat up a frozen dinner, and watch the news like millions of other Americans, never suspecting that some of the operations being reported on television might have succeeded because of equipment she had personally maintained and tested. For 22 years, Sara Martinez lived this routine, taking quiet pride in her perfect repair record and her reputation as the technician who never let anything slide. She thought she understood her place in the world, her contribution to the Navy's mission, and the scope of her importance to the larger organization. She had no idea that she was about to discover just how wrong she was about all of it. The first crack in Sara's understanding of her world came on a humid Tuesday morning in September. She had arrived at Building 47 at her usual time, coffee in hand, expecting another routine day of equipment maintenance. Instead, she found Chief Reynolds waiting by her workbench with an expression she'd never seen before, part nervous, part excited, and entirely serious. "Martinez, we need to talk," he said, gesturing toward his office. Sara followed, wondering if she'd somehow made an error in her work. In 22 years, she'd never been called into the chief's office for anything other than annual reviews and the occasional commendation. Reynolds closed the door behind them and sat heavily in his chair. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," he began. "In fact, what I'm about to tell you should have been classified above your clearance level for the past 2 decades, but circumstances have changed." Sara felt her stomach tighten. Had she been working on equipment she shouldn't have been? Had her security clearance somehow been compromised? "The equipment you've been maintaining," Reynolds continued, "it's not for regular Navy divers. It never has been. Every piece of gear that crosses your workbench is used by Naval Special Warfare operators. SEALs, Martinez. You've been maintaining equipment for Navy SEALs." The words hit Sara like cold water. SEALs. The elite of the elite. The warriors she'd seen in movies and documentaries. The ones who conducted impossible missions in hostile territories around the world. For 22 years she'd been supporting their operations without knowing it. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask. Reynolds leaned forward. "Because they want to meet you. The officers in charge of SEAL Team 4 have specifically requested a meeting with the technician who has maintained their equipment for over 2 decades without a single failure. They've been tracking your work, Martinez. They know your name. Sarah's mind reeled. All those years of wondering about the unusual wear patterns, the rush orders, the sophisticated equipment that seemed beyond standard Navy issue. It all made sense now. The scratches on the equipment housings weren't from training exercises. They were from real combat operations. The salt deposits weren't from routine dives in the Chesapeake Bay. They were from infiltrations in foreign waters. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "Why the secrecy? Why not tell me what I was working on?" "Need to know," Reynolds replied. "Your job was to maintain the equipment, not to know who used it or where. But your work has been so exceptional, so consistently perfect, that the operators themselves have taken notice. They want to express their appreciation personally." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday in a conference room Sarah had never been inside before. She spent the intervening days in a strange state of disbelief, looking at the equipment on her workbench with entirely new eyes. The rebreather she was currently servicing had been used by a Navy SEAL. The dry suit hanging on her repair rack had protected one of America's most elite warriors during an actual mission. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every component she touched now carried new weight. These weren't just pieces of equipment. They were tools that had been trusted in life-or-death situations by people who risked everything for their country. The magnitude of responsibility she'd been carrying without knowing it was overwhelming. Friday morning arrived with unusual autumn coolness. Sarah had barely slept, alternating between pride and anxiety about the upcoming meeting. She dressed more carefully than usual, choosing her best work uniform and making sure her boots were properly polished. The conference room was in the administrative section of the base, far from her usual workspace. When she arrived, she found 3 men in Navy uniforms waiting for her. 2 wore standard officer dress uniforms, but the third wore the distinctive trident pin of the Navy SEALs on his chest. "Ms. Martinez," the SEAL officer said, standing to shake her hand. "I'm Commander David Kellerman. This is Lieutenant Commander Rick Hawthorne and Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson. We've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time." Sarah shook their hands, noticing that all 3 men had the kind of firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of absolute confidence. These weren't desk officers. These were warriors who had seen combat. "Please sit down," Commander Kellerman said. "We have a lot to discuss." For the next hour, Sarah learned things about her work that transformed her understanding of her entire career. The equipment she maintained wasn't just used by SEALs. It was considered among the most critical gear in their inventory. Her maintenance records had been studied and used as training materials for other technicians. Her innovations and improvements to standard procedures had been incorporated into official maintenance protocols. "You've probably wondered about some of the damage patterns you've seen over the years," Master Chief Thompson said. "Equipment that looked like it had been through more than routine training." Sarah nodded. "I always wondered, but I figured it wasn't my place to ask." "That rebreather you repaired in March 2019, Lieutenant Commander Hawthorne continued, the one with the unusual scoring on the housing? That unit was used during a hostage rescue operation in the Mediterranean. The scoring came from dragging it across a rocky sea floor during a night infiltration. The family of 3 American hostages is alive today partly because that equipment worked perfectly when it mattered." Sarah felt her breath catch. She remembered that unit clearly. The unusual wear pattern had puzzled her, but she'd restored it to perfect working condition without question. "The dry suit you worked on last Christmas Eve," Commander Kellerman added, "when you came in on your day off because it was marked urgent. That suit was used by one of our operators during a reconnaissance mission that provided critical intelligence for preventing a terrorist attack on American soil." Each revelation hit Sarah harder than the last. She thought back to all the times she'd worked late, staying until she was satisfied that every component met her exacting standards. All those moments when she'd decided to replace a part that was technically still functional, choosing perfection over expediency. She'd been making those decisions based on an abstract sense of responsibility to unknown divers. Now she understood she'd been making life-or-death choices for America's most elite warriors. "Your work saved my life personally," Master Chief Thompson said quietly. 2 years ago, during an operation I can't discuss in detail, my rebreather malfunctioned at depth. But the backup systems you'd so carefully maintained and tested kicked in flawlessly. I made it home to my wife and daughters because you refused to accept good enough when you could achieve perfection." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. 22 years of work had suddenly taken on a meaning she'd never imagined. Every late night, every component she'd replaced out of an abundance of caution, every time she'd ignored pressure to work faster, it had all mattered in ways she'd never dreamed. "We wanted you to know," Commander Kellerman said, "that your contribution to our mission has been extraordinary, not just adequate, not just good, extraordinary. You've enabled operations that protected American interests around the world. You've helped save lives, prevented attacks, and supported missions that will never be declassified but made America safer." Sarah wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. "I just did my job," she said. "No," Master Chief Thompson replied firmly. "You did much more than your job. You brought a level of care and precision to your work that went far beyond what was required. You treated every piece of equipment like someone's life depended on it. And you were right. Someone's life did depend on it." As the meeting concluded, Sarah walked back to Building 47 in a daze. Her workspace looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. The equipment waiting on her bench wasn't just gear to be repaired. It was the lifeline for warriors who put themselves in harm's way to protect others. For 22 years, Sarah Martinez had thought she was just a very good technician. Now she understood she had been something much more significant. A silent guardian whose meticulous work had helped America's most elite warriors succeed in their most dangerous missions. The weight of this knowledge was both humbling and terrifying, because now she knew that every time she touched a piece of equipment, she wasn't just fixing mechanical problems, she was potentially holding someone's life in her hands. 3 weeks after learning the truth about her work, Sarah Martinez found herself facing the most challenging period of her entire career. The knowledge that she had been maintaining equipment for Navy SEALs hadn't just changed her perspective. It had fundamentally altered the pressure she felt every single day. What had once been methodical, almost meditative work had transformed into something far more intense. Every piece of equipment that arrived at her workbench now carried the weight of knowing that real warriors would stake their lives on her craftsmanship. The abstract responsibility she'd always felt had crystallized into something concrete and overwhelming. The first sign of trouble came when Sarah began second-guessing herself. A simple O-ring replacement that would have taken her 20 minutes in the past now consumed 2 hours as she inspected and re-inspected every component. She found herself disassembling units she had already completed, driven by nagging doubts about whether she had achieved the perfection that these operators deserved. Chief Reynolds noticed the change immediately. Sarah's productivity, which had been steady and reliable for over 2 decades, began to fluctuate wildly. Some days she would complete only half her normal workload, while other days she would work until midnight, unable to convince herself that any piece of equipment was truly ready. "Martinez, what's going on?" Reynolds asked one evening, finding her still at her workbench at 2,100 hours. "You've been here since 0500. Sarah looked up from the rebreather she was disassembling for the 4th time that day. Her eyes were bloodshot from strain, and her hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. "I keep finding things," she said, though she couldn't articulate exactly what she was finding. Minor imperfections that had never bothered her before now seemed like potential catastrophes. A seal that was 99.8% perfect might fail at depth. A valve that functioned flawlessly in testing might stick during a critical moment underwater. "These units passed all your tests 3 times already," Reynolds pointed out. "They're perfect." "Perfect isn't good enough anymore," Sarah replied, and Reynolds realized that learning the truth about her work had broken something fundamental in how she approached her job. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult week in October. Sarah had been assigned to service a complete set of equipment for an 8-man SEAL team: rebreathers, dry suits, depth gauges, and emergency systems. The gear had arrived with unusual damage patterns that suggested it had been through something extraordinarily demanding. As she worked on the first rebreather, Sarah found herself imagining the SEAL who had used it. She pictured him underwater in hostile territory, counting on every component to function flawlessly while enemy forces searched for him above. The weight of that imagined trust was crushing. She spent an entire day on the first unit, replacing components that were still within acceptable tolerances, adjusting systems that were already calibrated correctly, and testing functions that had already passed inspection. When she finally marked the unit as complete, She immediately began doubting her work. What if the pressure gauge wasn't accurate enough? What if the breathing mixture wasn't perfectly balanced? What if the backup systems failed to engage when needed? Unable to stop herself, she disassembled the entire unit and started over. By the third day, she had completed only 2 of the 8 rebreathers, and both had been torn down and rebuilt multiple times. Her workbench, usually organized with military precision, was cluttered with components in various states of inspection. Parts that she had removed, cleaned, tested, and approved were scattered around her workspace as she lost track of what had been checked and what still needed attention. The physical toll was becoming apparent. Sarah wasn't eating regular meals, surviving instead on vending machine snacks and endless cups of coffee. She wasn't sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, lying awake wondering if she had missed something critical in her work. Her hands, steady for 22 years, began to shake from exhaustion and stress. On Thursday morning, Chief Reynolds found her asleep at her workbench, her head resting on a technical manual, surrounded by the scattered components of the rebreather she had been working on for 4 straight days. "Martinez," he said gently, shaking her shoulder, "you need to go home." Sarah jerked awake, immediately reaching for the nearest piece of equipment. "I'm not finished," she said. "The team needs this gear. They're depending on me." "The team needs you to be functional," Reynolds replied firmly. "This isn't working. You're destroying yourself, and frankly, you're starting to make mistakes because you're so exhausted." The word mistakes hit Sarah like a physical blow. In 22 years, she had never made a mistake. Her perfect record was the foundation of her professional identity, the proof that she was worthy of the trust placed in her. "What mistakes?" she demanded, panic creeping into her voice. Reynolds showed her the component she had been working on when she fell asleep. In her exhausted state, she had cross-threaded a valve fitting, something so basic that a first-year technician wouldn't make such an error. The damaged threads would have made the entire unit unusable. Sarah stared at the ruined component, feeling 22 years of confidence crumble around her. She had always been able to trust her hands, her instincts, her methodical approach to every task. Now, knowing the true stakes of her work, she was making the kind of fundamental errors that could get someone killed. "I can't do this," she whispered, and for the first time in her career, Sarah Martinez considered walking away from her job. The crisis deepened over the following days. Word had somehow spread through the base that Sarah was struggling with her assignments. Other technicians began looking at her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Some offered to help, but Sarah couldn't bear the thought of anyone else touching equipment that would be used by SEALs. If she couldn't trust herself to do the work perfectly, how could she trust anyone else? The pressure became suffocating. Sarah found herself checking and rechecking her work obsessively, spending hours on tasks that should have taken minutes. She would complete a repair, then immediately begin doubting whether she had tightened bolts to the correct torque specifications or properly calibrated pressure settings. Sleep became impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw imaginary scenarios where her work failed catastrophically. She envisioned SEALs drowning because a SEAL she had installed wasn't properly seated, or operators being discovered by enemies because equipment she had maintained made noise when it should have been silent. The final straw came when Sarah received a rush order for emergency repairs on equipment needed for an immediate deployment. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly the kind of challenge she thrived on, a chance to demonstrate her skills under pressure. Instead, it became the moment when the weight of responsibility finally crushed her ability to function. Standing at her workbench with the damaged rebreather in front of her, Sarah realized that her hands were trembling so badly she couldn't hold her tools steady. The knowledge that somewhere a SEAL was waiting for this specific piece of equipment to complete a mission that might save lives had paralyzed her completely. For the first time in 22 years, Sarah Martinez walked away from her workbench with a job unfinished. She sat in her car in the parking lot of Building 47, crying as she realized that learning the truth about her work, something that should have filled her with pride, had instead broken her ability to do the job she had mastered over more than 2 decades. The woman who had maintained a perfect record for 22 years, who had unknowingly supported countless SEAL operations around the world, now felt completely incapable of touching another piece of equipment. The very knowledge that was meant to honor her contribution had become the source of her professional destruction. Sarah sat in that parking lot, wondering if her career was over and whether the SEALs who had depended on her for so long would now be put at risk because she could no longer trust herself to do the work that had once been as natural as breathing. Sarah Martinez hadn't left her apartment in 3 days. The official medical leave papers sat on her kitchen counter, signed by the base physician who had taken one look at her trembling hands and bloodshot eyes and immediately ordered 2 weeks of mandatory rest. But rest was impossible when her mind had become a battlefield where every thought was an enemy. The apartment that had been her sanctuary for 15 years now felt like a prison. Every surface reminded her of the routine she had lost. The coffee mug she'd used every morning before work, the alarm clock set for 0500 that now sat silent, the work boots by the door that hadn't moved since she'd kicked them off in defeat 3 days ago. Hulda K's, but it was the silence that was killing her. For 22 years, her days had been filled with the purposeful sounds of her work. The hiss of compressed air, the click of precision tools, the satisfying sound of components fitting together perfectly. Now there was nothing but the endless loop of her own thoughts, cycling through scenarios of failure and catastrophe. She found herself conducting imaginary conversations with SEALs she'd never met, apologizing for equipment failures that existed only in her mind. She would picture Master Chief Thompson, the man who had told her that her work had saved his life, and imagine having to tell him that she could no longer be trusted with something so important. The worst part was the dreams. When exhaustion finally forced her to sleep, her subconscious mind created elaborate nightmares where her imagined failures played out in vivid detail. She would see faceless SEALs underwater, struggling with malfunctioning rebreathers while enemy divers closed in. She would watch helplessly as dry suits she had supposedly repaired filled with water, dragging operators to their deaths in the dark ocean depths. Sarah would wake from these dreams gasping, her heart pounding as if she had been the one drowning. The line between her nightmares and her waking thoughts began to blur until she couldn't tell which failures were real and which were products of her deteriorating mental state. On the 4th day of her leave, the phone rang. Sarah stared at it for several rings, knowing it was probably Chief Reynolds checking on her progress. She had been avoiding his calls, unable to face the disappointment in his voice when she admitted she still couldn't bring herself to return to work. But when she finally answered, it wasn't Reynolds on the line. "Ms. Martinez, this is Master Chief Thompson. We met a few weeks ago." Sarah's throat went dry. The SEAL whose life she had supposedly saved was calling her personally. She wanted to hang up, to avoid having to explain her professional collapse to someone who had trusted her work with his life. "Master Chief," she managed to say. "I heard you've been having a rough time since our meeting," Thompson said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that Sarah imagined he used to steady his teammates during dangerous operations. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet with me, not officially, just 2 people talking." Sarah wanted to refuse, but something in Thompson's tone made her agree. They arranged to meet at a small diner off base, away from the official world of Building 47 and the weight of her responsibilities there. Thompson was already waiting when she arrived, sitting in a corner booth where he could see the entire restaurant, a habit, Sarah realized, of someone who had learned to always be aware of potential threats. He looked different in civilian clothes, more like someone's father than an elite warrior, but his eyes still held that steady confidence she remembered. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Sarah stared at her coffee cup, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't know if I can do the job anymore," she admitted. "Knowing what I know now, I keep thinking about all the ways I could fail, all the mistakes I might make. I've been paralyzed thinking about it." Thompson nodded slowly. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. Because what you're describing, that's something every SEAL goes through." Sarah looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "The knowledge that lives depends on your performance," Thompson explained. "It's one of the hardest things we deal with. Every mission, every decision, every moment of training, we know that mistakes can get people killed. Not hypothetically, not in some abstract way, but literally. Our teammates, innocent civilians, ourselves." He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. "The first time you really understand that weight, it can destroy you. I've seen tough operators, guys who seemed unbreakable, fall apart completely when they truly grasped what was at stake. Some never recover, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone understood what she was experiencing, terror that even elite warriors struggled with the same fears that were paralyzing her. "How do you handle it?" she asked. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee as he considered his answer. "You learn to trust your training," he said finally. "You accept that perfection is impossible, but preparation isn't. You focus on doing everything you can to be ready, and then you trust that when the moment comes, your training will carry you through." "But what if it doesn't?" Sarah pressed. "What if I make a mistake? What if someone dies because I wasn't good enough?" "Then you live with it," Thompson said bluntly. "But you don't let the fear of failure prevent you from trying. Because here's what you need to understand, Ms. Martinez. Your work has been saving lives for 22 years. Not might have been, not probably was, definitely was. I'm sitting here talking to you because of your work." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of metal, a component from a rebreather that Sarah recognized immediately. It was damaged, scored by what looked like shrapnel or debris. "This is from the unit I was using during the operation I mentioned in our meeting," Thompson said. "The one where my primary system failed and your backup system saved my life. Do you see this damage?" Sarah examined the component, her technical eye automatically assessing the wear patterns and stress points. Despite the obvious trauma the piece had endured, she could see that the critical seals and connections had held. "This unit took a direct hit from debris during an underwater explosion," Thompson continued. "Any normal equipment would have failed catastrophically. But because of the way you maintain and test everything, the extra attention you pay to redundant systems, the way you replace components before they reach their failure point, this unit keeps working. It kept me alive long enough to complete the mission and get home." Sarah stared at the damaged component, seeing for the first time physical proof of how her work had performed under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "The fear you're feeling," Thompson said, "that's not weakness. That's my responsibility. It's the same fear that makes SEALs check their equipment 3 times before a mission. That makes us rehearse procedures until they're automatic. The fear keeps you sharp, keeps you focused on what matters." "But I can't even hold my tools steady anymore," Sarah protested. "I made a mistake, the first real mistake in 22 years. "And what happened after you made that mistake?" Thompson asked. "Chief Reynolds caught it before the unit went out." "Exactly. The system worked. Your colleagues were there to catch the error, just like my teammates are there to catch mine. None of us work alone, Ms. Martinez. We're all part of a larger system designed to prevent any single person's mistake from becoming catastrophic." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something other than paralyzing fear. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was a recognition that her terror of failure might be proof of how seriously she took her responsibility, rather than evidence that she couldn't handle it. "I need you to understand something," Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Every SEAL who has used equipment you maintained has benefited from your obsessive attention to detail. Your refusal to accept good enough when you could achieve perfect has made the difference between mission success and failure, between operators coming home and not coming home." He stood to leave but paused before walking away. "The question isn't whether you're good enough for this job, Ms. Martinez. You've already proven that for 22 years. The question is whether you can find a way to trust yourself again. Because we need you. Not someone like you. We need you specifically." As Thompson walked away, Sarah remained in the booth, staring at the damaged component he had left with her. For the first time since learning the truth about her work, she found herself thinking not about all the ways she could fail, but about all the ways she had already succeeded. Sarah Martinez returned to Building 47 on a Monday morning in November, carrying Master Chief Thompson's damaged component in her pocket like a talisman. The conversation at the diner had given her something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not confidence exactly, but determination. She was ready to try again. Ready to trust in the 22 years of experience that had made her the technician the SEALs specifically requested. What she hadn't anticipated was how much her body had betrayed her during the weeks of stress and sleepless nights. Her first day back began with a simple task that should have been routine, replacing the seals on a depth gauge that had been returned for routine maintenance. Sarah approached her workbench with the methodical calm she had cultivated over 2 decades, but as she reached for her precision screwdriver, her hand began to shake. Not the violent trembling of panic she had experienced before her breakdown, but a subtle, persistent tremor that made fine motor control nearly impossible. The screwdriver slipped twice before she could properly seat it in the screw head, and when she finally managed to begin turning it, her grip was so uncertain that she over-torqued the fastener, stripping the threads. Sarah stared at the damaged component in disbelief. This wasn't a mistake born of exhaustion or psychological pressure. This was her body physically failing to perform tasks she had done thousands of times before. Over the following days, the extent of the physical damage became apparent. The weeks of stress, poor nutrition, and virtually no sleep had taken a toll that couldn't be overcome simply by returning to work. Her hands, which had been steady enough to perform microsurgery-level precision work, now trembled constantly. Her vision, strained from countless hours of obsessive inspection under harsh lights, had developed a persistent blur that made reading technical specifications difficult. Most concerning was her stamina. Tasks that had once taken her 2 hours now exhausted her after 45 minutes. Her back, conditioned by decades of bending over workbenches, now ached constantly. Her shoulders, used to supporting her arms during delicate work, cramped so severely that she had to stop every few minutes to stretch. Chief Reynolds watched her struggle for 3 days before intervening. "Martinez, we need to talk about realistic expectations," he said, finding her massaging her cramped hands after dropping a component for the 3rd time that morning. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I just need to get back into rhythm." "Your rhythm was built over 22 years of consistent practice," Reynolds replied. "You can't expect to bounce back from what you've been through in a few days. Your body needs time to recover, just like your mind did." But time was something Sarah felt she couldn't afford. While she had been struggling with her personal crisis, other technicians had been handling the SEAL equipment maintenance. The thought of operators depending on someone else's work that might not meet her standards, drove her to push harder despite her physical limitations. The pressure to regain her former capabilities led Sarah to make increasingly desperate attempts to compensate for her diminished abilities. She began arriving at work 2 hours early, hoping the extra time would allow her to complete tasks that now took longer. She stayed late, working under the poor lighting conditions of the evening shift because she couldn't finish her assignments during regular hours. The additional stress only made her physical condition worse. The tremor in her hands became more pronounced. Her vision problems worsened from straining to see fine details in inadequate light. Most dangerously, her judgment began to suffer as chronic fatigue clouded her decision-making. The crisis came when Sarah was assigned to service a complete diving system that had been damaged during what the work order cryptically described as field operations requiring immediate replacement. The equipment arrived in a condition she had never seen before, not just worn or stressed, but actively damaged by what looked like combat. The rebreather housing had impact damage that suggested it had been struck by something heavy and metallic. The breathing tubes showed signs of having been partially severed and field repaired with tape. Most concerning, the electronic systems had water damage that indicated the unit had been flooded, then somehow restored to partial function through emergency procedures. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly the kind of challenging repair that Sarah thrived on, a puzzle that required all of her expertise and experience to solve. Instead, it became a nightmare that highlighted every way her abilities had been compromised. The impact damage to the housing required precise machining to restore the proper seal surfaces. But Sarah's trembling hands made it impossible to achieve the tolerances necessary for a perfect repair. 3 times she attempted to machine new surfaces, and 3 times the tremor in her hands caused her to cut too deep, ruining components that were already in short supply. The water-damaged electronics required microscopic soldering work that demanded perfect vision and steady hands. Sarah found herself squinting through a magnifying glass, unable to clearly see the connection points she needed to repair. When she finally attempted the delicate work, her shaking hands caused her to bridge connections, potentially creating dangerous short circuits in critical systems. After 6 hours of struggling with repairs that should have taken her 3, Sarah was forced to admit defeat. The equipment wasn't just unrepaired. In some cases, her attempts had made the damage worse. Components that had arrived, damaged but functional, were now completely inoperable due to her failed repair attempts. The breaking point came when Chief Reynolds examined her work and found a critical error that could have been catastrophic. In her exhausted and frustrated state, Sarah had incorrectly wired a pressure sensor, creating a condition where the gauge would read normal pressure even if the system was completely depressurized. "Martinez," Reynolds said quietly, "if this unit had gone out like this, an operator could have descended to depth thinking he had full air supply when he actually had none. He would have discovered the problem only when he tried to breathe and found nothing there." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For the first time in her career, she had created a condition that could have directly killed the person using her equipment. Not through oversight or poor maintenance, but through active negligence caused by her diminished capabilities. Sarah looked at her hands, the hands that had maintained a perfect record for 22 years, that had been trusted by America's most elite warriors, that had saved Master Chief Thompson's life. They were shaking so badly now that she couldn't hold a pencil steady enough to write her own name legibly. The woman who had once been able to detect mechanical problems by feel alone could no longer trust her sense of touch. The technician who had spotted microscopic flaws in components could barely see well enough to read standard text. The professional who had worked for hours without fatigue now felt exhausted after basic tasks. "I think," Sarah said quietly, staring at her trembling hands, "I need to accept that I might not be able to do this job anymore." It was the hardest admission she had ever made. Not that she was afraid of the responsibility. Not that she didn't understand the importance of her work. But that her body had been so damaged by the stress of her breakdown that she might no longer be physically capable of performing at the level that SEAL operations required. The 22 years of perfect work, the reputation as the technician who never failed, the trust of warriors who had depended on her expertise, all of it might be ending not because she had lost her knowledge or dedication, but because her body had been pushed beyond its ability to recover. Sarah Martinez, who had always prided herself on being completely self-reliant, now faced the possibility that her career was over not due to any failure of will or competence, but because the human body had limits that even the strongest determination couldn't overcome. The medical evaluation took place in a sterile examination room at the Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, 40 miles from the base where Sarah Martinez had spent 22 years of her career. Dr. Patricia Lawson, a Navy physician who specialized in occupational health, conducted a battery of tests designed to determine whether Sarah's physical condition would allow her to continue in her critical role. The tests were humiliating in their thoroughness. Sarah's hands were measured for tremor frequency using electronic sensors. Her vision was tested under various lighting conditions that simulated her work environment. Her fine motor control was evaluated through tasks that mimicked the precision work she had performed thousands of times: threading tiny screws, manipulating delicate components, reading microscopic measurements. Each test confirmed what Sarah already knew. Her body had been fundamentally changed by the weeks of stress and breakdown. The tremor in her hands was permanent, a result of nerve damage caused by prolonged tension and poor nutrition. Her vision problems were similarly persistent, requiring corrective lenses that would make close-up precision work more difficult. Most concerning, her stamina and concentration had been reduced to a fraction of their former levels. "Ms. Martinez," Dr. Lawson said after reviewing the test results, "I have to be honest with you. The physical changes you've experienced are significant and likely permanent. Your fine motor control is compromised to a degree that would make precision work dangerous, both for you and for the people who depend on your equipment." Sarah sat in the examination chair, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "So that's it? After 22 years, I'm done?" "That's not necessarily what I'm saying," Dr. Lawson replied carefully. "But continuing in your current role would require modifications that might not be compatible with the level of precision your work demands." The recommendation that came from the medical board was devastating in its clinical language. Technician Martinez should be reassigned to duties that do not require fine motor precision or extended periods of concentrated work. In military bureaucracy terms, it was a polite way of saying she was no longer qualified for the job that had defined her adult life. Chief Reynolds broke the news to her personally, meeting her in the same conference room where she had first learned about the true nature of her work. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The room where she had discovered her importance had now become the place where she learned it was ending. "There are other positions," Reynolds said, trying to soften the blow, Administrative roles, training positions, quality control oversight? Your experience and knowledge would be valuable in any of these areas. But Sarah knew that none of these alternatives would give her the direct connection to the operators whose lives depended on perfectly maintained equipment. She would become another bureaucrat, removed from the actual work that mattered, relegated to filing reports about other people's craftsmanship. The thought of training other technicians was particularly painful. How could she teach someone else to achieve the standards she could no longer meet herself? How could she pass on techniques that required steady hands when hers shook constantly? What Sarah didn't know was that her situation had reached the attention of people far above Chief Reynolds in the chain of command. The reputation she had built over 22 years, combined with the recent revelation of her crucial role in SEAL operations, had made her case a matter of interest to officers who rarely concern themselves with individual technicians. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, just as Sarah was cleaning out her personal items from her workbench in preparation for her reassignment. Commander Kellerman, the SEAL officer who had first revealed the truth about her work, wanted to see her immediately. This time, the meeting wasn't in a conference room, but in a secure facility that Sarah had never been inside before. Commander Kellerman was there, along with Master Chief Thompson and two other officers she didn't recognize. The atmosphere was different from their previous meetings, more formal, more urgent. "Ms. Martinez," Commander Kellerman began, "we've been informed about your medical situation and the recommendation for reassignment. Before any final decisions are made, we have a proposal we'd like you to consider." Sarah looked around the room, confused about why SEAL officers would be involved in personnel decisions about a technician. "I don't understand." "Your knowledge and experience are too valuable to lose," Master Chief Thompson said. "Over the past month, we've been working with medical personnel and engineering specialists to develop a solution that would allow you to continue contributing to our mission, despite your physical limitations." One of the officers Sarah didn't recognize stepped forward. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sandra Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. We've been researching adaptive technologies that could compensate for the physical issues you're experiencing." Walsh activated a tablet and showed Sarah images of equipment she had never seen before: precision tools with stabilizing mechanisms, magnification systems with enhanced lighting, ergonomic workstations designed to reduce physical strain. "The technology exists to neutralize most of the physical limitations you're dealing with," Walsh explained. "Tremor dampening systems for fine work, advanced optical systems for detailed inspection, fatigue monitoring equipment that would alert you before your concentration degrades to dangerous levels." Sarah stared at the images, hardly daring to hope. "Does this exist?" "Some of it is already in use in surgical suites and aerospace manufacturing," Commander Kellerman said. "What we're proposing is adapting these technologies specifically for your work environment and training you to use them effectively." But there was more. Master Chief Thompson pulled out a folder containing documents Sarah couldn't immediately understand. "We're also proposing a change in your role that would address both your physical limitations and your unparalleled expertise." The proposal was unlike anything Sarah had imagined possible. Instead of simply maintaining equipment, she would become the lead quality assurance specialist for all SEAL diving equipment. Her workstation would be equipped with the most advanced diagnostic and repair technologies available, allowing her to work at a level of precision that exceeded even her former capabilities. More importantly, she would be responsible for training and overseeing other technicians, ensuring that the standards she had maintained for 22 years would be passed on to the next generation of equipment specialists. Her trembling hands would be steadied by technology, but her knowledge and judgment would guide an entire program. "There's one more thing," Commander Kellerman said. "This position would come with a security clearance upgrade and full briefings on the operations your equipment supports. No more working in the dark about how your maintenance affects our missions." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were offering. It wasn't just a way to continue working despite her limitations. It was an expansion of her role that would allow her to have an even greater impact on SEAL operations than she had achieved in 22 years of individual work. "Why?" she asked. "Why go to all this trouble for one technician?" "Because," Master Chief Thompson said, "in 22 years you've proven that you're not just any technician. You're the technician who never failed, who treated every piece of equipment like someone's life depended on it, who maintained standards that exceeded what anyone thought possible. That level of dedication and expertise can't be replaced. It can only be supported and amplified." The final test wasn't a medical evaluation or a skills assessment. It was a simple question that would determine whether Sarah Martinez could find a way to continue serving the operators who had depended on her for over 2 decades. "The technology can compensate for your physical limitations," Commander Kellerman said. "The question is whether you're willing to learn new ways of doing the work you've mastered, and whether you can trust that excellence doesn't always look the same as it used to." Sarah looked at her trembling hands, then at the faces of the officers who had gone to extraordinary lengths to find a way for her to continue contributing to their mission. For the first time since her breakdown, she felt something she had thought was lost forever, the possibility that her best work might still be ahead of her. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in a workshop that bore little resemblance to the cluttered workspace she had occupied for 22 years. The new facility was a testament to cutting-edge technology and human adaptation, a place where her limitations had been transformed into advantages through innovation and determination. The tremor-dampening workstation responded to the slightest movement of her hands, using gyroscopic stabilization to counteract the trembling that had once threatened to end her career. Advanced optical systems provided magnification and lighting that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Ergonomic supports reduced the physical strain that had accumulated over decades of bent-over precision work. But the most significant change wasn't in the technology. It was in Sarah herself. Where once she had worked in isolation, knowing nothing about the ultimate purpose of her craftsmanship, she now operated with full knowledge of how every component she touched would be used in the field. The security clearance upgrade had opened a world of understanding that transformed her approach to every task. She knew that the rebreather she was currently calibrating would be used by SEAL Team 6 in an operation to neutralize a terrorist cell planning attacks on American soil. She understood that the precision of her work on the depth sensors would determine whether operators could navigate safely through underwater cave systems to reach their targets. She comprehended that the backup systems she so meticulously tested might be the difference between mission success and the loss of America's most elite warriors. This knowledge, which had once paralyzed her with fear, now energized her with purpose. The difference was that she no longer carried the burden alone. Around her, 3 junior technicians worked under her guidance, each learning the standards and techniques she had developed over more than 2 decades. Petty Officer Rebecca Chen, fresh from technical school, was mastering the art of pressure testing under Sarah's patient instruction. Seaman Marcus Johnson was learning to read the subtle signs of component fatigue that only experience could teach. Petty Officer 3rd Class Amanda Torres was developing the obsessive attention to detail that had defined Sarah's career. "Remember," Sarah told Chen as the young technician struggled with a particularly complex seal replacement, "this isn't about following the manual exactly. The manual gives you the minimum standard. Our job is to exceed that standard every single time." She watched Chen's technique improve under her guidance, seeing her own dedication and precision being passed on to a new generation. But more than that, she was training these technicians with full knowledge of why their work mattered, something she herself had been denied for over 2 decades. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The woman who had once worked in fearful isolation now led a team that understood their collective mission. The technician who had once doubted every decision now made choices based on comprehensive knowledge and shared responsibility. The validation of her new approach came through results that exceeded even her previous standards. Equipment failure rates in the field had dropped to 0, not just for the gear she personally maintained, but for all equipment serviced by her team. The combination of her experience, advanced technology, and comprehensive training had created a maintenance program that surpassed anything previously achieved. But the most meaningful validation came from the operators themselves. Master Chief Thompson visited the workshop regularly, not for official inspections, but to personally thank Sarah and her team for equipment that had performed flawlessly in conditions that would have destroyed lesser gear. "Last month in the Arabian Sea," he told Sarah during one such visit, "the rebreather you personally calibrated kept one of our operators alive during a 40-minute underwater approach. The precision of your pressure settings allowed him to conserve enough air for the return trip when the mission ran longer than expected." These stories, which once would have terrified Sarah with their implications of life and death responsibility, now filled her with quiet pride. She understood that her work was saving lives not through accident or luck, but through the deliberate application of expertise, technology, and teamwork. The greatest test of her transformation came when Sarah was asked to brief a group of SEAL candidates on equipment maintenance and care. Standing before 30 of America's most elite warriors in training, she realized how completely her perspective had changed. "Your equipment is not just tools," she told them, her voice steady and confident. "Every component has been designed, manufactured, tested, and maintained by people who understand that your lives depend on flawless performance. But that equipment is only as reliable as your understanding of its capabilities and limitations." She demonstrated proper equipment handling techniques, explained the principles behind each system, and most importantly, taught them to recognize the signs of potential problems before they became fatal failures. The candidates listened with the intense attention of people who understood they were receiving information that could determine whether they lived or died in the field. After the briefing, one of the candidates approached her. "Ma'am, I've heard that you've been maintaining our equipment for over 20 years without a single failure. Is that true?" Sarah smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "It's true that I maintained equipment for 22 years without a field failure," she said. "But what's more important is that we now have a system that ensures that record will continue, regardless of who's doing the work." That evening, Sarah stood alone in her workshop after her team had gone home. The advanced equipment hummed quietly around her, a symphony of technology and precision that represented the evolution of her craft. On her desk was a commendation letter from the admiral in charge of naval special warfare, recognizing her contributions to operator safety and mission success. But the letter that meant the most was handwritten from a SEAL operator she had never met. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that the equipment you maintained saved my life last week during an operation I can't discuss. But more than that, knowing that someone with your dedication and expertise was responsible for my gear gave me the confidence to push the mission to its limits. I made it home to my family because of your work. Thank you." Sarah Martinez had begun her career as a young woman who simply wanted to serve her country in whatever way she could. She had spent 22 years thinking she was just a technician doing routine maintenance work. She had endured a complete breakdown when she learned the true stakes of her responsibility. She had faced the possibility that her career was over due to permanent physical limitations. Now she stood as the leader of the most advanced military equipment maintenance program in the world, training the next generation of technicians, while continuing to personally ensure that America's most elite warriors had equipment they could trust with their lives. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Sarah Martinez had evolved from a skilled individual contributor to a force multiplier, whose impact would extend far beyond her own hands and expertise. She had learned that excellence isn't diminished by limitations, it's defined by how we overcome them. As she turned off the lights in her workshop, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The young woman who had walked through the gates of Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek 23 years ago had wanted to make a difference. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, not despite her struggles and setbacks, but because of how she had risen above them. Tomorrow she would return to work with steady hands, enhanced by technology, clear vision sharpened by knowledge, and unshakable confidence built on the foundation of lives saved and missions accomplished. She would continue training the technicians who would carry on her legacy, knowing that the standards she had established would protect operators she would never meet in operations she would never hear about. Sarah Martinez had found her calling not once but twice, first as the perfectionist technician who never failed, and then as the leader who ensured that no one else would fail either. The woman who had fixed equipment for 22 years had discovered that her greatest achievement wasn't maintaining a perfect record, but creating a system that would maintain perfection long after she was gone. In the end, she had learned the most important lesson of all. True expertise isn't about what you can do alone, it's about what you can enable others to accomplish together. The ripple effects of Sarah's transformation extended far beyond her immediate workshop. Word of the revolutionary maintenance program she had developed began spreading throughout Naval Special Warfare Command. Other bases requested copies of her training protocols. Military contractors sought her input on equipment design. Foreign allies asked for consultation on their own special operations maintenance programs. What had started as an accommodation for one technician's physical limitations had evolved into a paradigm shift in how the military approached critical equipment maintenance. The integration of advanced technology with human expertise, the emphasis on comprehensive training rather than rote procedure following, and the philosophy of exceeding standards rather than merely meeting them became the new benchmark for military technical operations. Sarah found herself traveling to installations she had never imagined visiting. At Naval Base Coronado in San Diego, she observed SEAL training firsthand, watching candidates struggle through the same grueling exercises she had heard about but never witnessed. For the first time, she saw the physical and mental demands placed on the warriors who would depend on her equipment. Standing on the beach where Hell Week had broken countless strong men, Sarah watched current trainees stumble through surf torture, their bodies pushed beyond normal human limits. She understood now why her equipment had to be absolutely perfect. These operators would be using it while functioning at the very edge of human capability, with no margin for mechanical failure. "It's humbling, isn't it?" said Captain Jennifer Walsh, the commanding officer who was escorting Sarah through the training observation, "seeing what they go through to earn the right to use the equipment you maintain." Sarah nodded, watching a trainee struggle to his feet after completing an underwater knot-tying exercise while holding his breath for what seemed like an impossible length of time. "I wish I had seen this 20 years ago," she said. "Understanding the human element would have made me an even better technician." But perhaps the most meaningful expansion of her role came when Sarah was asked to participate in post-mission equipment analysis. When SEAL teams returned from operations, their gear was examined not just for damage but for performance data that could improve future equipment and maintenance protocols. The first such analysis session Sarah attended involved equipment that had been used during a hostage rescue operation in Southeast Asia. The mission had succeeded, but the gear told a story of challenges and adaptations that no after-action report could fully capture. This rebreather housing shows impact damage consistent with contact with concrete structures, explained Lieutenant Commander Brian Foster, the intelligence officer leading the analysis. The operator reported having to crawl through a drainage tunnel that was smaller than anticipated. Sarah examined the damaged equipment with her trained eye, but now she could visualize the SEAL crawling through that tunnel, depending on her maintenance work to keep his breathing apparatus functioning in conditions no manual had ever described. The scrapes and dents weren't just wear patterns. They were evidence of courage and determination, testimonies to missions that protected American lives. "The pressure regulator you calibrated last month performed flawlessly," Foster continued, "even though it was subjected to depth pressures 30% beyond its rated capacity. The operator had to go deeper than planned to avoid detection." Each piece of analyzed equipment became a lesson for Sarah's training program. The real-world stresses revealed by operational use informed new testing protocols. The innovative field repairs performed by operators under extreme conditions led to improved equipment designs. The feedback loop between field operations and maintenance excellence grew stronger with every mission. Sarah also began participating in equipment development meetings with defense contractors. Her unique perspective, understanding both the theoretical capabilities of equipment and the practical realities of how it performed under extreme conditions, made her input invaluable for designing the next generation of SEAL gear. "The current depth gauge design assumes operators will have time to read it carefully," Sarah pointed out during one such meeting with engineers from a major defense contractor. "But in reality, they need to be able to get critical information in a split second, often in complete darkness, while under extreme stress." Her suggestions led to new interface designs that prioritized intuitive operation over technical elegance. Equipment that looked impressive in laboratory settings was redesigned to function reliably in the chaotic reality of combat operations. The international aspect of her work proved equally rewarding. When Allied Special Operations units requested training on American equipment maintenance standards, Sarah found herself working with technicians from Britain's Special Air Service, Australia's Special Air Service Regiment, and Canada's Joint Task Force 2. "Your approach to preventative replacement," said Sergeant Major Ian MacLeod from the British SAS, "has reduced our equipment failure rates by 40%, but more importantly, it's given our operators confidence that their gear won't let them down when it matters most." These international exchanges enriched Sarah's understanding of how different military cultures approached the same fundamental challenge, ensuring that elite warriors had equipment they could trust completely. She learned new techniques from foreign specialists while sharing the innovations she had developed over 2 decades of American military service. The academic world also took notice of Sarah's work. Military engineering programs began inviting her to speak about the intersection of human factors and mechanical reliability. Her presentations at conferences attracted attention from industries far beyond military applications. Aerospace, deep-sea exploration, space programs, and emergency response teams all faced similar challenges in maintaining equipment that had to perform flawlessly under extreme conditions. "The principles you've developed," said Dr. Robert Hayes, a professor of mechanical engineering at the Naval Postgraduate School, "have applications far beyond military operations. The medical device industry, in particular, could benefit from your approach to redundant systems and preventative maintenance." But for all the recognition and expansion of her influence, Sarah's most meaningful work remained in her daily interactions with the technicians she trained and the operators who depended on their collective expertise. Each morning she arrived at her workshop, knowing that the decisions made that day could determine whether American warriors completed their mission successfully and returned home safely. The workshop itself had become a destination for visitors who wanted to understand how the military was adapting to combine human expertise with technological advancement. Journalists, defense officials, and allied military representatives regularly toured the facility, but they all left with the same impression. The technology was impressive, but the real innovation was in how Sarah had created a culture of excellence that transcended individual limitations. "Technology is just a tool," Sarah would tell these visitors. "The real secret is building a team that refuses to accept anything less than perfection, not because they're afraid of failure, but because they understand the human cost of imperfection." Her training program had become so successful that it was being implemented at military installations worldwide. The combination of comprehensive technical education, full operational context, and adaptive technology was producing technicians who exceeded the standards Sarah had maintained during her individual career. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had once worked in fearful isolation now thrived on collaboration and mentorship. The technician who had been paralyzed by the weight of responsibility now found strength in sharing that responsibility with a team she had trained to her exacting standards. On quiet evenings in her workshop when the day's training was complete and her technicians had gone home, Sarah would sometimes pause in her work to reflect on the improbable journey that had brought her to this point. The young woman who had simply wanted to serve her country had become a force multiplier whose influence extended around the world. The tremor in her hands, once a source of shame and despair, now served as a daily reminder that limitations could be transformed into strengths through adaptation and determination. The technology that compensated for her physical challenges had become the foundation for revolutionary advances in equipment maintenance across the entire military. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that expertise wasn't diminished by acknowledging limitations. It was enhanced by finding ways to overcome them. The breakdown that had nearly ended her career had instead led to breakthroughs that benefited every operator who would ever depend on perfectly maintained equipment. As she locked up her workshop each evening, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. The woman who had fixed equipment for 22 years had discovered that her greatest achievement wasn't maintaining a perfect record. It was creating a legacy that would protect warriors she would never meet, in operations she would never know about, for generations to come. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.